Your security dashboard is green. Everything looks fine. Policies are in place. Alerts are flowing. You're monitoring. But in reality, that dashboard is a snapshot of a world that no longer exists. You have 500 applications. You have 10,000 identities. You have a governance model built for 2010. Most security teams think they're in control because they can see the portal. But portals are rear-view mirrors. They show you what happened, not what's happening. And they definitely don't show you what's about to break. That's where Microsoft Graph changes everything. Graph isn't another tool. It's the structural layer underneath all of M365. It's where the actual decisions happen. Every sign-in, every permission grant, every policy evaluation, they all happen in Graph first. The portal just shows you the aftermath. And if you understand how to use it, you can automate security in a way that portals never will. Today, we're not looking at dashboards. We're looking at the model behind them. Why portals are killing your security. Here's what happens every single day in your tenant. The portal shows you state, not flow. A snapshot at 2 p.m. says your environment looks secure, but by 3 p.m., 50 new OAuth grants have been created. By 4 p.m., someone signed in from an impossible location. By 5 p.m., a user has already downloaded 10,000 files. And your dashboard still shows green, because dashboards don't update in real time. They update when they update. Conditional access policies feel like they're protecting you. You've set them up. You see them in the portal. You think they're working. But enforcement latency means real-time protection is a myth. A policy you create today might not be enforced on every endpoint until tomorrow. Full propagation can take 24 hours. So a risky user signs in while your new policy is still rolling out. By the time the policy is everywhere, the damage is already done. You're monitoring alerts. Your SOC team is watching. Tickets are being created. But here's the problem. You're monitoring the alerts that are being triggered. You're not monitoring the alerts that should be triggered but aren't. The gaps are invisible. A risky sign-in that doesn't hit your threshold still happens. It just never creates an alert. So it never gets investigated. Your audit logs tell you what happened. Great. A user changed a mail rule. An admin modified a conditional access policy. A service principal read 50,000 mailboxes. The logs recorded, but the logs don't tell you why it happened. They don't tell you if it was legitimate. And they definitely don't tell you what you should do about it right now. You do manual reviews. Once a quarter, someone sits down and audits app permissions. You find an app that's been decommissioned but still has access. You remove it. You feel confident that you've tightened your environment. But here's the trap. Permissions change daily. Apps request new scopes. Users grant consent to new applications. In the 90 days between your audits, your permission landscape has completely shifted. Manual reviews create false confidence. They make you think you have control when you actually don't. The real security decisions don't happen in the UI layer. They happen in the API layer. The portal is just a window into that layer. And windows are incomplete. They show you only what the UI developers decided to show you. They hide complexity. They smooth over latency. They make everything look simpler and more controlled than it actually is. So when you're looking at a green dashboard, you're not looking at your actual security state. You're looking at a simplified representation of a moment in time. The moment has already passed. The threats have already moved. Your environment has already changed. That's the fundamental problem with portal-based security. You already understand the problem now. Understanding why portals fail is the first step. But understanding what Graph can do, that's the leap, the structural flaw in M365 governance. Here is the core problem underneath all of this. Your M365 governance model was built around one assumption, state management. You set a policy, you check it once in a while, you assume it holds, you create a conditional access policy and it stays there. You grant an app permission and that permission remains until you manually revoke it. You assign a user to a security group and they stay in that group. The system is supposed to be stable, predictable, governed. But modern identity and application security doesn't work that way anymore. It is not about state, it is about flow. Think about what is actually happening in your tenant right now. There is a continuous stream of sign-ins happening hundreds of times per minute from real users and automated services. Tokens are being issued and used. OAuth apps are being granted permissions, sometimes with user consent and sometimes with admin approval. Users are being added to groups while mailboxes are being accessed and files are being downloaded. Policies are changing. Configurations are drifting. And all of this is happening simultaneously in a distributed system across multiple data centers with inconsistent timing and propagation. Your governance model does not see flow. It sees snapshots, it sees endpoints and state transitions, but it misses the continuous movement underneath. Here's what that breakdown looks like in practice. A user grants consent to an OAuth app right now. 10 seconds ago, you will not know about it until your audit runs. By audit time, that app might have already read the user's email, downloaded their files, and started using their identity to access other resources. The damage is not from the permission grant itself. The damage is from everything that happened between when the grant was approved and when you finally discovered it. Conditional access policies have propagation delays. You create a policy and it goes into effect immediately in the portal, but it does not enforce everywhere at once. The policy has to propagate to every endpoint, every cloud region, and every authentication flow. That process takes time. Meanwhile, users are signing in. Some of them are risky. Some of them should be blocked. But the block does not happen because your new policy has not reached their sign-in server yet. Permission creep happens invisibly. An app requests mail, read-write, and you approve it. 6 months later, that same app requests files, read-write, then directory, read, and then calendar, read-write. Each request seems reasonable in isolation, so each one gets approved. But now that app has accumulated enough permissions to read your entire tenant's email files and calendar. You do not know it is overprivileged until an incident happens or a threat hunt discovers it. The fundamental mismatch is this. M365 is a distributed system. Everything is happening continuously. Everything is interconnected. But you are trying to govern it like it is centralized and static. You are trying to manage flow with state-based controls. That is the structural flaw. That is why portals create the illusion of control while the actual system operates beneath that illusion. This is where Microsoft Graph becomes the connective tissue. It is not just another API. It is the actual governance engine underneath the UI. It sees the flow. It can react to the flow. And if you build your security model around Graph instead of around portals, you can finally govern the system as it actually operates. Well, what Microsoft Graph actually is. Let's be precise about what we're talking about. Microsoft Graph is the unified REST API that exposes the entire M365 system. Users, groups, devices, mail, calendar, files, Teams conversations, and SharePoint sites are all accessible through Graph. Security alerts, identity events, audit logs, risk detections, policy configurations, application registrations, and permission grants are there too. Conditional access policies and device compliance states have endpoints. Every resource in Microsoft 365 has a place, and every operation has a corresponding API call. But here is what most people miss about Graph, and this is the critical insight. Graph is not just an API. It is not a wrapper around M365 that lets you do what you could already do in the portal. Graph is the control plane. It is the actual governance engine. Every decision that happens in Microsoft 365 flows through Graph first. Every sign-in, every policy evaluation, every permission grant, and every audit event starts there. The decision happens in Graph, and only then does the UI show you the result. Think about how sign-in works. When a user tries to sign in, that request does not go to the portal. The portal is not evaluating anything. The request goes into the authentication pipeline, which calls the Graph APIs under the hood. Those Graph APIs check the conditional access policies. They evaluate the risk. They determine if MFA is required. They issue or deny tokens. All of that happens in Graph. The portal is just a window into that process. It shows you logs of what already happened. The portals you use are all just UI layers built on top of Graph. The Microsoft 365 Admin Center, the Entra ID portal, the Defender portal, and the Purview Compliance Center are just skins. When you change a conditional access policy in the portal, you are not changing the portal's copy of the policy. You are sending a request to Graph to update it. When you view sign-in logs, you are not querying the portal's local database. You are calling Graph. The portal is a visualization layer. The real system is Graph. This is the structural shift that most organizations do not recognize. They treat the portal as the primary interface and Graph as an optional alternative. But it is backwards. Graph is the primary system. The portal is the optional visualization. Graph exposes the data as it actually happens. Sign-in logs appear with minutes of latency rather than days. Risk detections stream in as the ML models identify them. Security alerts aggregate across Defender products in a unified schema. Audit events log configuration changes in real time. Activity logs record every HTTP request made to Graph by every application in your tenant. This is the raw flowing data of your security model, not snapshots, flow. And here is the part that matters most. Graph is programmable. You can automate decisions. You do not have to watch the dashboard and manually click buttons. You can build a system that injects into Graph, pulls the data out, evaluates it, and triggers responses automatically and continuously without human intervention. This is a fundamental capability shift. Most security teams are reactive because they are bound to portal workflows. A person sees an alert, they investigate manually, they make a decision, and they take an action. Automation is limited to what the portal's UI can do. But Graph lets you build systems that are proactive, systems that respond to events faster than a human can notice them, systems that correlate data that humans would never correlate because the cognitive load is too high. Microsoft understands this. That is why in 2026 they are retiring legacy APIs. MDE and XDR APIs are being deprecated by February 2027. The old Alerts API is gone by April 2026. Reporting web services is retired the same month. The Purview Audit Search Graph API is now the standard for querying audit data. Microsoft is consolidating everything onto Graph Security API v2. This is not an optional migration. It is structural. Everything is moving onto the unified control plane. The organizations that build their security model around Graph now will have a structural advantage. They will not be stuck in portals or manual processes. They will be operating closer to how the system actually works. The identity illusion. Everyone thinks identity security is about passwords and MFA. Strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, password resets, locked accounts. That's where most organizations focus. You set a complex password policy, you mandate MFA for your admins, and you set up passwordless sign-in. You feel like you finally solved identity security, but in reality, you haven't. You've solved maybe 20% of the problem, the rest is invisible. Because the real identity layer isn't what you're protecting, it's the token layer. Here's what actually happens when a user signs in. They authenticate with a password, a fingerprint, or a passkey, and once that authentication is successful, the system doesn't grant them access directly. Instead, it creates a token. That token is a temporary cryptographic key that proves they've authenticated, and it's used for everything they do in the system from that point on. They use that token to access email, files, Teams, and SharePoint. The token is the actual key to the kingdom, not the password, the token. Once a token is issued, the original authentication is irrelevant. Your fancy passwordless sign-in created a token, and that token can be used by anyone who possesses it. It can be stolen, it can be replayed, or it can be exfiltrated to another country and used to access your tenant while the original user is asleep in their office. Your strong password policy doesn't protect the token. Your MFA requirement doesn't protect the token. Once the token is issued, the original authentication controls are out of the loop. Graph exposes this token layer. It shows you sign-in logs, which reveal who authenticated and when, and it shows you risk detections where ML models analyze whether that sign-in looked legitimate. It shows you risky users who have exhibited suspicious behavior, and it shows you risky sign-ins that the system flagged. It even shows you authentication context, which is metadata about the sign-in like location, device, IP address, and browser. This should give you complete visibility into your identity layer, right? You can see every sign-in, you can see which ones are risky, and you can see which users are compromised, so you can protect yourself. Except there's a catch. Latency sign-in logs appear in Graph with a 2 to 5 minute delay. That's the 95th percentile, meaning that by the time you see that a user signed in, those 2 to 5 minutes have already passed. In 2 minutes, an attacker with a stolen token can do serious damage. They can read a user's email, they can download their files, and they can set up forward mail rules to themselves. They can even grant themselves permissions while the sign-in log that's supposed to alert you to the attack shows up after the damage is already done. Conditional access is your blocking mechanism. You create a policy that says if a sign-in is risky, you require MFA. That sounds good, but the policy takes up to 24 hours to fully propagate to every endpoint. A risky sign-in that happens today might not be blocked by your new policy until tomorrow, and in the meantime, if someone hasn't already triggered the policy, they're in. And then there's the enforcement gap that's being closed in 2026. Low-privilege OAuth flows, which are the kind that apps use to request basic directory access, could bypass conditional access policies in certain configurations. This gap exists right now, and it reveals how fragile the model is. Graph gives you visibility into all of this. You can see which users are flagged as risky, you can see which sign-ins were risky, and you can see whether your policies were actually applied. You can even see the risk detections that triggered the flagging. But seeing isn't controlling. You're still reactive. You're still looking at data that's minutes old about events that already happened. That's the identity illusion, the application permissions crisis. Your tenant has 500 applications, maybe more enterprise apps that were installed 5 years ago, SaaS tools that different departments requested, custom applications built by your dev team, integrations with business partners, security connectors that feed data into your CM. How many of those do you actually know about? How many have admin consent and how many of them have permissions that they don't actually use? OAuth permissions are the new perimeter. Not users, not devices, not locations, applications. And most organizations have completely lost control of them. Here's the permission model. An application requests access to your tenant and asks for specific scopes. Mail.readWrite.all means the app can read and write every email in your entire tenant, not just the user's email, every mailbox. Directory.readWrite.all means the app can create users, modify user attributes, change group memberships, and delete accounts. Files.readWrite.all means it can read and modify every file in SharePoint and OneDrive across your entire organization. Graph exposes all of this. Service principals, app registrations, permission grants, role assignments. You can see every application and every permission it has, which allows you to audit the entire landscape. But most organizations don't. The visibility exists and the API is there, but the governance doesn't exist. And that's the real problem. There's a specific scenario that happens over and over. We call it the ghost grant. An application gets installed, it gets permissions, and everyone works with it for a while. Then the department that requested it gets reorganized and the app becomes irrelevant. Someone decommissions it or just stops using it, but the permission grant stays in place. It's still in your system and still accessible. Months later, someone else needs a similar capability, and because they don't know the old app still exists, they request a new one. You end up with two apps doing the same job, both with full permissions and both potentially unused. Now imagine that decommissioned app gets reactivated by someone who shouldn't have access to it, or imagine its credentials get leaked. Now you have a dormant permission grant that's suddenly active again and you have no idea it exists. Permission creep is slower, but equally dangerous. An app launches with minimal permissions like mail.read, which is reasonable because it just needs to read user email. 6 months later, the vendor releases a new feature that requires writing back to the user's mailbox, so the app requests mail.readWrite. It gets approved because it makes sense. Then another feature comes out, and now it needs access to the user's calendar, then files, then directory information. Each request seems reasonable in isolation, but now you have an application that started with read-only email access and has accumulated permissions to read and write email, read calendars, read files, and enumerate your entire directory. Nobody made a single decision to give it all of those permissions. It just accumulated them over time, and there's no clean audit trail of why each permission was granted. The most dangerous permission type is application permissions. With delegated permissions, at least, there's a user context where the app acts on behalf of a user. But application permissions are different because the app acts as itself. There's no user signing in and no interactive authentication. The app authenticates with a client secret or certificate, it requests a token, the system issues it, and now the app has direct access to your tenant without any user involvement. A compromised application secret is catastrophic. An attacker with that secret can authenticate as the app, request a token, and access anything the app has permission to access. Your entire mailbox directory, your entire file repository, and your entire user directory are all open. The user who authorized the application never sees a sign-in prompt or anything else because the attack is purely API-based. Graph gives you the ability to prevent this. You can inventory all your applications, you can identify which ones have high-risk permissions, and you can determine whether those permissions are actually being used by analyzing Graph activity logs. You can see what each app is doing, you can revoke permissions that aren't needed, and you can delete applications that are no longer in use, but you have to actively use it. Most organizations don't. They install applications, they grant permissions, and then they forget about them. Those permissions remain, accumulating quietly until something breaks. Signal versus noise. Your SOC team is drowning, not in threats, in alerts. Thousands of them arrive every day. Tens of thousands on a busy week. Most are false positives. Low-severity events that don't need investigation. Duplicate alerts for the same issue from different sources. Old alerts that never got closed. Your team's inbox is a fire hose. This creates a specific psychological problem. When your environment is screaming at you constantly, you stop listening. Alert fatigue. It's documented. It's real. Your analysts see an alert, and their first instinct isn't, what does this mean? It's, is this one of the ones I actually need to care about? By the time they figure out that 80% of them don't matter, they've already stopped paying attention to the other 20%. The critical alerts get lost in the noise. Graph Security API pulls alerts from everywhere. Defender for Endpoint sends alerts about endpoint threats. Defender for Office 365 sends alerts about email threats. Defender for Identity sends alerts about authentication anomalies. Defender for Cloud Apps sends alerts about risky behavior. Third-party security vendors can send alerts too. It's supposed to be a unified view of everything threatening your organization. Except they're not unified. Not really. A Defender for Endpoint alert has a different structure than a Defender for Office 365 alert, different fields, different severity mappings, different category schemes. Your CM has to normalize them all. Your automation has to handle the variations. Your alerting rules have to account for the differences. It's fragmentation hidden inside an aggregation layer. Microsoft knows this. That's why in 2026, they're moving the entire alert system to Alerts v2, a single unified schema. Legacy alerts are being deprecated by April of 2026. This forced migration isn't about features. It's about fixing the structural problem that alerts have become ungovernable. Graph gives you filtering. You can filter by severity, status, category, or time window. You can pull only alerts that are critical, only alerts that haven't been resolved. Only alerts from specific sources. It sounds like a solution. Tighter filters means less noise, right? Wrong. Filtering is a band-aid on a structural problem. The real issue isn't the alerts you're seeing, it's the alerts you're seeing at all. You're still ingesting massive volumes of data. You're just filtering it downstream instead of filtering it upstream. That's more expensive, it's slower, and you're still dealing with the alerts that make it through the filter. But here's the problem. The solution isn't better filtering, it's better reasoning. You need correlation. One alert might be meaningless, but one alert combined with another alert, combined with a user risk detection, combined with unusual graph activity. That's a pattern. That's something worth investigating. Graph has the data to build those correlations. Risk detections, user behavioral signals, activity logs, identity context. But most organizations ingest the alerts separately from that context. They filter alerts and ignore the underlying signals. Then there's enrichment. An alert arrives saying, account accessed from unusual location, useful information. But if you enriched that alert with, this account is part of the CFO's team, and the unusual location is a known business partner's office, suddenly the alert becomes either critical, investigate immediately, or authorized travel, close alert. The real power isn't filtering alerts, it's reasoning about them in context, correlating them with other signals, and deciding what actually matters. That's where automation comes in. It's not just about removing humans from the loop, it's about letting humans focus on actual threats instead of burning out on noise. The automation gap. Manual security operations are slow by design. An alert fires. Someone on the team gets notified. They read the alert, which takes time. They check the context, which means opening other tools and running queries. They investigate the underlying events. Then they make a decision about what to do. Then they take the action. This entire cycle, from alert to decision to action, takes hours, sometimes days. By the time a human has investigated a risky sign-in, that sign-in is old news. The attacker is already gone, or already deeper into the system. Graph enables a fundamentally different model. You ingest alerts automatically, you evaluate the risk programmatically, you trigger remediation actions without waiting for a human to review the alert. The entire cycle, from event to decision to action, happens in seconds. Not hours, seconds. But here's where most organizations get stuck. Automation requires governance, and governance is where the real complexity lives. If you automate the wrong action, you can cause serious damage. Disable a user account automatically because of a risky sign-in. Now you've locked out a legitimate user who was just traveling. They can't access their email. They can't do their job. Meanwhile, the attacker is still in the system, just in a different account. You've hurt the business and missed the threat. Revoke all tokens for an account with risky activity? That sounds smart. But if you do it automatically without any approval gate, you might revoke tokens for legitimate background services that user relies on. Those services stop working, integrations break, data pipelines fail. The automation that most organizations implement is low risk, triage and enrichment. An alert comes in, automatically pull the user's risk history, check their role, look up what team they're on, and add that context to the alert. Now, when a human analyst looks at it, they have the background information ready. This automation is safe, it can't break anything. It just makes the human's job easier. But low-risk automation doesn't solve the speed problem. You're still waiting for a human to review before anything happens. Medium-risk automation is different. When an alert fires, automatically disable the user's sign-in capability, revoke their active sessions, force a password reset. These actions are reversible. If you did it by mistake, you can undo it. But they require governance. You need approval workflows. You need role-based access control around who can trigger these automations. You need safety gates that prevent the same account from being disabled twice in an hour, which might indicate a buggy automation. High-risk automation is destructive. Disable an application entirely, delete a service principal, permanently revoke permissions. These actions can't be reversed easily. They require multiple approvals, they require audit trails, they require investigation. Most organizations never implement high-risk automation. They stick with level 1 and maybe dabble in level 2. Graph gives you the APIs for all 3 levels. The real challenge is the governance infrastructure around levels 2 and 3. You need to think about safety, reversibility, approval chains, and audit trails. Most organizations don't have that infrastructure built yet. But here's the actual insight. Automation isn't about removing humans, it's about removing delay. Humans still make the critical decisions, but they make them faster because the supporting data is ready. They don't have to spend 30 minutes investigating. They spend 30 seconds reviewing what's already been enriched. Then they approve or deny the proposed action. Graph activity logs show you whether your automations are working. You can see every API call. You can verify that your remediation workflows are actually triggering. You can catch bugs or misconfigurations before they cause problems. And if an attacker is abusing Graph, you can see that too. The latency reality. You think Microsoft Graph gives you real-time security data, real-time alerts, real-time visibility, real-time response. Real-time is a myth. Audit logs usually have a 2 to 5 minute latency. Configuration changes, admin actions, mailbox access. Everything gets recorded, but there is always a delay. Your audit trail is accurate and complete, but it is always looking at the past. Security alerts are even worse. The latency isn't consistent because alerts come from different sources. A Defender for Endpoint alert might show up within seconds if a device sends it immediately, but a Defender for Office 365 alert might take minutes while the email gets analyzed. A Cloud App Security alert might take even longer as behavioral patterns get evaluated. You have no idea if an alert is stale when it arrives. There is a technology called Continuous Access Evaluation that can help with tokens. If a user's risk level spikes and they get flagged as risky, CAE can revoke their tokens in near real time, up to 15 minutes. Not instantly, not even close to instant, but close. The catch is that most organizations haven't enabled CAE, so they don't get that capability at all. Policy changes propagate slowly. You create a new conditional access policy and enable it. You think it is now protecting every sign-in in your tenant. But that is not how it works. The policy has to replicate to every authentication server and every cloud region where sign-ins happen. That replication takes time, up to 24 hours for complete propagation. So here is the actual operational reality. You cannot design your security around real-time graph data. You cannot assume that by the time you see an event, you can still prevent it. The event has already happened, the tokens have already been issued, the permissions have already been granted. You are always responding to something that is already in motion. This isn't a technical limitation that will be fixed. This is structural. Distributed systems have latency, and there is no way around it. The design principle that actually works is defense in depth. Not perfect real-time blocking, not catching every threat the moment it starts, but layered controls that limit damage even if one layer is breached. A user signs in from an unusual location. You don't see that sign in for 5 minutes. Their token is now active and usable for 5 minutes without any extra controls. So you need a second layer. conditional access policies that evaluate context continuously, or CAE that can revoke the token if new risk information emerges, or application-level checks that re-evaluate whether the user still has access. An app gets overprivileged. By the time you audit it, it has been overprivileged for months, so you need monitoring that catches unexpected behavior. Graph activity logs that show the app doing something it has never done before. Alerts that fire when an app makes unusual bulk requests. These alerts might have minutes of latency, but they catch the behavior while it is happening. The organizations that use Graph effectively don't build systems that depend on real-time data. They build systems that assume latency and design for resilience. They layer their controls. They accept that detection will take minutes. They focus on making sure that even with those minutes of delay, they can still limit the blast radius. Risky users as a continuous signal. Identity protection is running in the background of your Entra ID right now. Machine learning models are analyzing every sign-in. They are looking for patterns that don't match normal behavior. Impossible travel. A user signs in from New York, then from London 3 minutes later. Malware-linked IPs. A sign-in came from an IP address known to host botnet activity. Leaked credentials. The user's password appeared in a breached database on the dark web. Atypical behavior. The user just accessed files they have never touched before at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. These signals flow into Graph through the identity protection APIs. You can query risky users, you can look at risky sign-ins, you can examine the raw risk detections that triggered the flagging. The data is there. Continuous. Streaming. You see it a few minutes after it happened, but you see it. Here is the critical insight that most organizations miss. Risk isn't binary. A user isn't either safe or compromised. Risk is probabilistic, continuous. A user can go from no risk to at risk based on a single event, then they can get remediated and return to no risk. Then they can drift back into at risk as more suspicious events accumulate. It is not a state, it is a signal. And that signal changes constantly. The practical model is treating risk detections as a continuous stream that you are always monitoring. A user gets flagged as risky. You have visibility into why. What detection triggered it? Impossible travel, leaked credentials, atypical file access. Graph gives you that granularity. You can list all risky users right now. You can filter them by risk level. You can pull the complete history of risk events for a specific user and see how their risk has evolved. This is where automation becomes valuable. When a user's risk level crosses a threshold, you can trigger a response without waiting for a human to notice. Force them to re-authenticate with MFA. Require a password reset. Block their sign-in entirely pending investigation. But here's the catch. You have to be careful. Risk detection models are good, but they are not perfect. False positives happen. An executive traveling internationally might trip impossible travel detections. Someone whose password was leaked in a breach they didn't cause might get flagged. If your automation disables every flagged user immediately without any approval gate, you will break legitimate users. The 2026 shift is important here. Microsoft is improving the ML models that power risk detection. They are adding new detection types. The signal is getting richer, but that also means your automation logic needs to adapt. A detection type that didn't exist last year might exist next year. Your automation needs to handle new signals gracefully. The real insight is something subtle. Risky users aren't security incidents. They are signals that warrant investigation and potentially remediation. A user flagged as risky isn't necessarily compromised. They are someone who exhibited behavior that the system flagged as unusual. Your job is to decide whether that unusual behavior is actually malicious or just normal variance. That decision requires context, it requires investigation, it requires a human applying judgment. Graph gives you the visibility and the APIs to investigate quickly. You are not waiting for a security analyst to manually pull logs from 5 different places and piece together a timeline. You have a unified signal, you can see the risk detection, you can see the supporting events, you can make a decision. Conditional access as programmable policy. Conditional access is where the rubber meets the road. It is the actual enforcement mechanism. When a user tries to sign in or an app requests a token, conditional access is the engine that decides the outcome. Allow the request, block the request, require MFA first. But here's the problem. This is where most security thinking breaks down. Most organizations build their policies in the portal using a point-and-click approach. They set rules like requiring MFA for unknown locations or blocking access when sign-in risk is high. Because you can see these policies and modify them manually, they feel like they are working. The flaw is that organizations treat these policies as static objects. You create a rule, enable it, and assume it protects you forever. But in reality, conditional access works differently. Every time a user signs in, the engine evaluates that request against every single policy you have created. This does not happen in your portal or on your own servers. It happens inside the authentication pipeline. The engine looks at the context, the person, the app, the location, the device, and the risk level, and makes a decision in milliseconds. That is where Graph changes the model. Graph exposes these policies through the identity endpoint, allowing you to list, create, update, or delete them programmatically. Anything you can do in the portal, you can now do at scale through code. This means you can build automations that respond to threats faster than any human admin could. And one level deeper, there is a critical architectural gap you need to understand. While the evaluation of a sign-in happens in milliseconds, policy propagation is slow. When you update a policy via the API or the portal, it can take up to 24 hours to reach every authentication endpoint. This creates a window where a new policy exists, but some sign-ins are not yet being checked against it. By 26, Microsoft is closing a specific hole in this enforcement model. Currently, low-privilege flows that only ask for basic directory access can sometimes bypass certain configurations. The new structural fix ensures that every flow, even the smallest ones, must answer to policies targeting all resources. Conditional access generally makes one of three decisions. It blocks the sign-in, it allows the sign-in, it demands more proof. Those extra controls might be MFA, a compliant device, or a password reset. You can even combine them, like blocking access unless a user has a managed device and uses passwordless sign-in. Graph also includes the what-if API. Since it is currently in beta, the details might shift, but the core function is powerful. It lets you simulate a decision without anyone actually signing in. You provide a hypothetical scenario, a specific user, device, and app, and the API tells you exactly what would happen. This prevents the nightmare scenario where a small mistake in a policy locks out your entire company. The automation potential here is massive. Instead of clicking through the portal, you can update your security posture in response to real events. If a user's risk level spikes, your system can automatically trigger a policy that requires MFA for just that person. If an insider threat is detected, you can block access to sensitive data instantly. But here is where governance becomes critical. Conditional access is a blunt instrument. If you block the wrong condition, you stop legitimate work. If you require device compliance before your fleet is ready, you break the business. These mistakes do not just hurt security, they paralyze operations. The real insight is this. Conditional access is your structural enforcement layer. Graph is the programmable interface to that layer. Together, they allow you to move away from static rules and toward a system that evolves as the threat landscape changes. The audit log model. Audit logs are your forensic record. They capture the truth of what happened in your tenant. Every sign-in, every admin action, every configuration drift. From file access to mailbox forwarding rules, every change is documented. Graph exposes these logs through specific endpoints for sign-ins and directory audits. There is also the newer Purview Audit Search API, which is the direction Microsoft is pushing everyone toward. By 26, the legacy ways of accessing these logs will be gone, and everything will live inside Graph and Purview. What makes audit logs valuable is that they are a complete historical record. Unlike real-time systems that might drop data to keep up with speed, audit logs keep everything. When you need to investigate a user 6 months after an incident, the data is still there. You can reconstruct every move they made during that window, but that completeness comes with a trade-off. The latency we see in other systems exists here too. Audit logs usually appear in Graph with a delay of 2 to 5 minutes. This means you are always looking at the past. For forensics, a 5-minute delay is fine, but for catching an active attack, it is too slow. You do not use these logs to stop a thief. You use them to see what they stole. The volume of data is the next big hurdle. A large organization can generate millions of events every single day. Every time someone checks an email or a policy is evaluated, a new line is written. Ingesting and storing all of that is incredibly expensive. So what is actually happening is a shift in strategy. The practical approach is to stop trying to ingest everything. You have to filter at the source and focus only on the events that actually matter. Failed sign-ins, role assignments, policy changes, privilege escalations. These are the signals that indicate a real security impact. Everything else is just noise that clutters your database and inflates your bill. Graph uses OData filtering to help with this. You can ask the API for failed sign-ins from high-privileged users over the last hour or admin actions from the last 30 days. Because the filtering happens on Microsoft's side, you aren't pulling millions of useless rows into your own environment. You only get what you asked for. The shift coming in 26 is a hard deadline for your infrastructure. Microsoft is retiring the old audit APIs. If your current automation or compliance tools are still relying on those legacy endpoints, they will stop working. Moving to the graph-based Purview API is no longer a suggestion. It is a requirement. The structural reality is that audit logs are a forensic tool, not a detection tool. They are reliable and essential for compliance. They tell you how an attacker got in. They show you what data was touched. They provide the evidence for legal teams. But because of that 2 to 5 minute delay, they cannot be your first line of defense. You need other tools for real-time response. Audit logs are for the moments when you have to look backward and ask, what actually happened? Graph activity logs as your API visibility layer. There is a layer of visibility that most organizations completely miss. It isn't because the data doesn't exist, it's because they don't know where to look every time an application calls Microsoft Graph. Every request, every operation, every attempt to touch your data, it gets logged. The app identity, the endpoint, the timestamp, the IP address, the specific data it tried to reach, whether it worked or failed, how long it took, everything. This is Graph Activity Logs. It is the most powerful tool you have to see what applications are actually doing inside your tenant. Think about the implications. You have an app that requested mail, Read-write all, that is a dangerous scope. You approved it because the vendor claimed they needed it for the tool to work. But what if they never use it? What if they are just hoarding permissions just in case? Graph activity logs give you the truth. You can see every single API call that app makes, and if it never touches that mail scope, you can see that clearly. You can revoke the access, you can reduce the scope. You can eliminate exposure that never should have been there in the first place. Now look at the other side. An app gets compromised. An attacker has the credentials. They are using that app to steal your data. What does that look like in the logs? It looks like a broken pattern. An app that usually makes 10 calls a day is suddenly making 10,000. An app that normally reads one mailbox is suddenly scanning 50. A service that only runs during business hours is suddenly active at 3 a.m. These patterns show up in the logs almost immediately. It is near real-time visibility into an active attack. The volume is the challenge. A large organization with heavy graph usage can generate millions of log entries every single day. You cannot process that scale manually. You need automation to ingest it, filter it, and tell you when something is wrong. The right approach is to build filtering on top of the raw feed. Do not try to look at every request. Instead, look for the patterns that actually matter. High volume spikes from a single app, activity from an ID you don't recognize. Requests to endpoints that the app has no business touching. These patterns surface the risk without drowning your team in noise. You should ingest these logs into your CM. When your CM correlates graph activity logs with other signals, the picture gets clear. A spike in failed graph calls combined with identity risk detections isn't just a glitch, it's a story. The story might be a credential compromise or it might just be a misconfigured app, but the correlation makes it something you can actually act on. The data lake approach is for the long term. You store the raw logs for months or years. When an incident finally happens, and you need to investigate what an attacker did 6 months ago, you have the record. You can pull the history for a specific app and see exactly what it accessed and how much data it took. There is a distinction here that matters. Audit logs tell you what happened in your services. A user opened a file. A mailbox was accessed. A policy changed. Graph activity logs tell you how it happened, which app made the call, what it requested, what the response was. It is the difference between knowing a theft happened and knowing exactly how the thief moved through the house. The structural insight is simple. Portals show you the surface of M365. They show you users and files, but they don't show you the API layer underneath. Graph activity logs close that gap. They are your window into the engine room. They allow you to govern the entire ecosystem of applications that depend on Graph rather than just the settings in a dashboard. OAuth permissions as your real perimeter. Your perimeter isn't a firewall. It isn't your network boundary. Your real perimeter is OAuth permissions. Think about what happens when an app gets permissions in your tenant. Mailed, read, write. All doesn't mean the app can read one person's mail. It means it can read and write every single email in your entire organization. Thousands of mailboxes. Directory. Read, write. All is even more dangerous. That scope lets an app create users, change group memberships, and delete accounts. It is tenant-wide administrative power wrapped in an API scope. When you grant these permissions, you aren't just giving access to a resource, you are handing over the keys to the entire system. If that app is compromised, or if the vendor turns malicious, those keys are now in the wrong hands. Your email, your directory, your files. Whatever the permission covers is now completely exposed. Graph exposes this entire landscape. Service principals, app registrations, role assignments. You can see every app and every permission it holds. You can audit the entire list. But most organizations don't do this. They install the app, grant the consent, and then they forget. The permissions stay active, they stay unused, they create a massive silent attack surface. The model has 2 types of permissions, and they work very differently. Delegated permissions are when an app acts on behalf of a user. The user signs in, they authenticate. The app can only do what that specific user is allowed to do. If the user can't see a file, the app can't see it either. There is a human in the loop. There are sign-in prompts. There is friction. In this case, friction is a security feature. Application permissions are the real risk. The app does not act for a user. It acts as itself. It authenticates with a secret or a certificate. It gets a token. It does the work. There is no user involved, no sign-in prompt, no consent visible to anyone. A compromised app secret is a catastrophe because an attacker can authenticate as the app and access everything it has permission to touch. Your mail, your users, your data. And because the user never signs in, the attack is purely API-based. It is invisible to anyone who is only watching the sign-in logs. The governance model for this is straightforward, but it takes discipline. First, you need an inventory. List every app, find the ones with admin consent, find the high-risk scopes. Second, you have to ask if those permissions are actually being used. Graph activity logs will show you the truth. If an app has mail, read-write, all but only ever reads messages, it is overprivileged. The permission is there, but it isn't necessary. Third, you have to revoke the access, delete the grant, shrink the scope. Keep only what the app actually needs to function. This is a massive opportunity for automation. You can build loops that identify unused permissions and remove them automatically. You can create workflows that flag high-risk grants for manual review. This isn't a one-time project. It is continuous governance. Permissions change, apps evolve, usage shifts. Your security posture has to move with them. In 2026, Microsoft is adding even more specific types like Mail Advanced, Read-Write. These new scopes require admin consent and are much more tightly controlled. This is Microsoft acknowledging that the old model was too broad. Some operations are just too dangerous for basic permissions. This creates a new challenge for you. As these types appear, you have to understand what they do and whether your apps actually need that level of power. The problem is that permissions are static. You grant them once and they sit there forever. But the way apps are used is dynamic. A vendor adds a feature. A business process changes. An app that didn't need write access 6 months ago might need it today. Or it might not need it at all and the vendor just asked for it to be safe. Your permissions get out of sync with reality. You end up overprivileged, which creates risk, or underprivileged, which breaks your tools. The real model is this. Permissions are your security perimeter. It isn't about users, it isn't about devices, it is about applications. If an app has dangerous permissions, that app is a danger to your business, no matter how well you've secured everything else. If you give 10 different apps mail, read-write all, you have created 10 different paths for an attacker to steal every email you own. The permissions are what actually matter. Programmatic permission revocation. You know which permissions are dangerous. You've identified the applications that have them. You're ready to fix it. So you delete the permission grant. Done. The app no longer has access. But in reality, it's more complicated than that. Revoking permissions sounds straightforward. It's not. The challenge isn't technical. The technical part is easy because Graph exposes 2 different revocation patterns and both of them work perfectly. The challenge is business impact. If you revoke a permission an application actually relies on, that application breaks. Data stops flowing. Integrations fail. People call your help desk wondering why their workflow is broken. The 2 patterns are worth understanding because they give you optionality. Full revocation means you delete the entire permission grant. The application no longer has any access to what it previously could access. Clean, complete, but destructive if you got it wrong. Partial revocation means you reduce the scope. The permission grant still exists, but the app's capabilities shrink. It keeps mail read instead of mail, read write read only instead of read write, user read instead of directory, read write all. The app still functions, but with less exposure. The practical workflow goes like this. First, identify which permissions are high risk or probably unused. Graph activity logs show you this. Second, evaluate the business impact if you remove them. Will removing this permission break anything? Talk to the people who use the app. Check the vendor documentation. Do your homework. Third, execute the revocation carefully. For high-risk permissions, do partial revocation first if possible. Reduce scope rather than eliminate access entirely. Monitor what happens. Fourth, if nothing breaks after a trial period, you can either leave it at the reduced scope or go for full revocation. The safety challenge is real. You revoke a permission, and an hour later the app starts throwing errors. A critical business process fails. Now you're rolling it back at 2 in the morning. This is why testing matters. This is why you don't revoke permissions from 1,000 applications simultaneously. You do it methodically, in small batches, with monitoring. Graph activity logs are your safety net here. Before you revoke anything, look at what the application actually does. If an app requested mail, read-write. All but you can see from the activity logs that it only ever makes read requests to mail, then mail, read-write. All is overprivileged. You can safely reduce it to mail. Read all. The app will still work, but its exposure shrinks. This reveals an automation opportunity that most organizations never implement. You can build a continuous loop. Every quarter or every month, if you're aggressive, pull the complete permission inventory. Cross-reference it with graph activity logs. Identify permissions that haven't been used in the past 90 days. Flag them for review. For permissions the app definitely doesn't use, you can even automate the partial revocation, reducing the scope without requiring manual approval. But governance matters. Permissions should be reviewed at least quarterly. High-risk permissions, the ones that give access to sensitive data or to administrative functions, should be reviewed more frequently. Some organizations review them monthly. Some review them whenever an app makes a request for a permission bump. The real insight is architectural. Permission revocation isn't a project. It's not something you do once and then forget about. It's a continuous process. As your organization grows, new applications appear. As applications age, their requirements change. As vendors update their software, permission requirements shift. Your permission landscape is always drifting. Without continuous review and revocation, it drifts toward overprivilege. Graph enables that continuous process. You have the visibility, you have the APIs, you have the data to make informed decisions at scale. Most organizations just don't use it. Detecting malicious graph activity. An attacker gets into your tenant through one of 2 paths. They compromise an application's credentials. Maybe they stole a client's secret from a GitHub repo, or they broke into the vendor's infrastructure. Now they can authenticate as that app. Or they trick a user into consenting to a malicious application. A phishing email that looks like it's from a vendor, but really it's asking for permission to access mail. Read-write all on behalf of that user. Either way, they now have programmatic access to your tenant. What comes next is data theft, a real attack. They're not doing anything that looks like a typical breach. They're not moving files around in SharePoint. They're not sending emails from compromised mailboxes. They're using the Graph API to read data at scale. One Graph call can pull thousands of emails. Another call pulls file metadata from across your organization. Another call enumerates all your users. Another creates a new service principal for persistence. All of it through the API layer. Here's where Graph activity logs become your detection mechanism. When a normal application uses Graph, there's a pattern to it. It makes a few calls per day, maybe per hour, depending on what it does. It accesses specific endpoints. It reads data that matches its declared purpose. The activity has rhythm and scope. When an attacker uses Graph, they break that pattern immediately. The signatures are distinct. An app that normally makes 10 API calls per day suddenly makes 10,000. An app that normally reads one user's mailbox starts reading 50. An app that was installed last week to manage room reservations is suddenly calling the directory API to enumerate all users in the tenant. These aren't subtle changes. They're violations of the established pattern. Graph activity logs show you all of it. Which app made the call? What endpoint? What time? From what IP? How many results? Whether it succeeded. You build a baseline, what is normal for this app, and you alert when activity deviates from that baseline significantly. But here's where it gets more powerful. You correlate Graph activity logs with identity risk signals. A user got phished. They entered their credentials on a fake login page. Entra ID detects the compromised password and flags the account as at risk. Now that user tries to sign into a malicious app they just consented to. The app authenticates the user and requests tokens. Entra ID issues the tokens, but the sign-in is flagged as risky because the credentials are known to be compromised. And then immediately afterward, that app starts making unusual Graph calls. Massive reads. Unusual endpoints. That's a correlation. That's the story. Compromised credentials. Malicious app data theft in progress. When you see that pattern, you don't wait for a human to investigate. You automate the response. Revoke the app's tokens immediately. Disable the service principal. Remove the permission grants. Force the user to reset their password. The entire response happens in seconds. By the time the attacker even realizes the tokens are dead, you've already stopped them. The investigation workflow is where you really leverage the visibility Graph gives you. The app was running for 4 days before you caught it. In those 4 days, what did it access? Graph activity logs give you the answer. Every API call, every operation. You can see exactly which mailboxes were read, which files were downloaded, which users were enumerated. You can trace the blast radius. You can figure out what data was stolen and what didn't get accessed. Most critically, you can see if the attacker created persistence. Did they create new service principals? Did they modify conditional access policies? Did they create new applications? These administrative actions leave traces. Graph audits them. You can see what was changed and reverted. The real model is this. Graph is both your visibility layer and your enforcement layer. You see attacks happen. You respond to them automatically. The entire cycle, detection to containment, takes minutes, not hours. That's the structural shift. That's what separates organizations that get breached from organizations that get attacked and survive. Building executive risk posture. Executives have one question, not 5, not 10, just one. Are we secure? Everything else they ask, whether it's about compliance, risk, or trends, is just a variation of that same core question. But here's the problem. Security teams answer in technical language. They talk about 427 risky sign-ins or a secure score of 72. They mention conditional access policies covering 65% of the user base. These numbers are accurate. They are real data points, but they don't actually answer the executive's question. They just create more confusion. Graph gives you the raw material to build a real answer. You have access to secure scores, risk detections, alert volumes, and permission inventories across the entire tenant. But raw material isn't an answer. It's just noise without context. The translation layer is where your value lives. Instead of reporting 427 risky sign-ins, you tell them that 2.3% of sign-ins are flagged as risky, which is down from 3.1% last quarter. Now the executive understands there is a baseline, there is a direction. They can finally see if the organization is getting better or worse. Secure score is your headline metric. It's a simple number from 0 to 100 that represents your posture across identity, devices, data, and apps. Graph exposes this through the security secure scores endpoint. You pull it, you track it. If the score was 62 last quarter and it's 69 today, you are improving. The executive sees that number and understands it immediately because it's quantifiable and trackable. But secure score alone is incomplete. It's like looking at a stock price without knowing what the company does. The number doesn't tell the full story. You need supporting metrics to explain what's happening underneath. Take MFA coverage. You need to know what percentage of your users are actually using it, not just who has it configured. If only 40% of users use MFA, you have massive exposure. If 95% use it, you're in a strong position. This one number tells an executive if your identity layer is hardened. Then there's conditional access coverage. These policies are your enforcement mechanism. If only 30% of the org is covered, then 70% of your users can sign in from anywhere on any device without controls. That is a clear statement of risk. When 95% are covered, you have continuous enforcement. You also have to look at application permission risk. It's not about how many apps you have. It's about how many have dangerous permissions like mail, read-write. All that could lead to data theft. 100 apps with high-risk permissions is a catastrophe, but 10 is manageable. This metric tells an executive if the application layer is a threat. The dashboard model is simple, 3 to 5 metrics, not 20, not 50. When you give an executive 20 metrics, they understand 0 of them. Too much data creates paralysis. Pick the metrics that matter. Risk trends, response speed, and automation coverage. These 4 points tell a story. Reporting frequency matters too. Executives don't need daily dashboards. They need monthly or quarterly reports that show trends rather than snapshots. They want to hear that you closed 94% of alerts within 4 hours this month compared to 87% last month. That positive trend is what they value. The real insight is deceptively simple. Your job isn't to report data, it's to translate data into the language of risk. Graph provides the raw ingredients, but your responsibility is to cook them into something an executive can actually act on. Technical excellence is just the starting point. Translation is what makes you valuable. The graph-driven SOC model. A traditional security operations center works like a factory with a backlog problem. Alerts arrive, the queue grows. An analyst picks one up and starts investigating. That investigation means opening multiple tools and running queries across different systems to pull logs and check asset inventories. 30 minutes later, they finally have enough context to make a decision. They execute a response, but the next alert is already waiting. This is reactive security. You're always behind. You're always processing yesterday's problems. A graph-driven SOC flips the model. You aren't reacting to alerts after they arrive. You are continuously monitoring data streams and enriching them with context automatically. You correlate across sources programmatically and trigger responses without waiting for a human to catch up. The architecture has 4 distinct layers. The first layer is ingestion. This is the raw data from graph, alerts, audit logs, and risk signals. These streams flow constantly. The practical piece here is filtering. You don't ingest everything. You filter at the source for high-severity alerts and unusual admin actions. This filtering layer determines what actually enters your pipeline. Use the Graph Security API to pull alerts from Defender and filter them by severity. By sending only high and medium alerts to your CM and moving low-severity items to a batch queue, you reduce your data volume by half. The second layer is enrichment. An alert says a user signed in from an unusual location. That's risky, but you need to know if that user is high privileged or just traveling for business. You need to know if their device is compliant or if they are a contractor. These context pieces turn a statistic into a signal. Graph gives you this data. The user object contains roles. The device object shows compliance. Group membership tells you if the user is critical. You cross-reference the sign-in event with the directory and attach that context automatically. Now, when an analyst sees the alert, they don't have to investigate the user separately because the context is already there. Layer 3 is correlation. This is about multiple signals pointing to the same threat. A user is flagged for identity risk, they're making unusual graph calls, and they're accessing files they never touch. In isolation, these might look like false positives. Together, they are a story of a compromise. Graph enables this because all the data lives in one ecosystem. You aren't trying to match events across different platforms using fuzzy logic. You are correlating within a unified model. The fourth layer is response. When signals align, you have to act intelligently. The response isn't just a human deciding. It's an automated decision based on governance rules you've already defined. Triage enrichment can be fully automated with no approval needed, but disabling a user account or deleting a service principal requires an approval and an audit trail. Here is how layers 3 and 4 work together. An alert fires and is automatically enriched with user and device context before the system correlates it with identity risk flags. The correlation is strong. The system evaluates your response rules and determines that the situation warrants disabling the sign-in. The system doesn't just kill the account. It drafts the action, logs it, and sends it to an approval queue. The analyst reviews it in 5 seconds and approves it. The entire cycle, from ingestion to execution, takes minutes instead of hours. The governance model is critical here. Not all automations are equal. Some are safe enough to run alone, while others need a human to confirm or even multiple people to sign off. You have to think about your automation in tiers based on how dangerous the action is. The real structural insight is this. A graph-driven SOC removes delay. It doesn't remove humans. Humans still make the critical decisions, but they make them faster because the supporting work is already done. The data is gathered, it's enriched, it's correlated, it's just waiting for judgment. That is the only model that actually works at scale. Designing your graph data architecture. When you move to a graph-driven security model, you are signing up for a massive, non-stop stream of data. Alerts flow in, logs stream, risk signals arrive. The volume is staggering, and a large tenant can easily generate millions of events every single day. Every event is potentially valuable, but every event is also potentially noise. Your data architecture determines if you can actually handle that volume, or if you drown in it. The model that actually works splits your incoming data into 3 paths. It's not about being elegant. It's about the fact that different data serves different purposes. The hot path is for data that drives immediate decisions, like alerts and risk signals that need a response right now. You ingest these into your SIEM or real-time analytics platform so they are available immediately. In this path, query latency is everything. You need responses in seconds. If an alert takes an hour to show up, it is useless to your team. It is better to pay more for faster ingestion than to save a few dollars and lose your ability to react. Alerts from Defender endpoints and risk detections from identity protection belong here. They are queryable within seconds. Your SOC analysts see them immediately. Your automations can react immediately. The warm path is for data you query frequently, but not necessarily in real time. Audit logs, activity logs, configuration changes. These have a higher tolerance for latency. If an audit log takes 15 minutes to appear, that is acceptable for a forensic investigation. You aren't making split-second decisions based on these logs because you are using them to investigate and correlate what happened. The timeline here is minutes, not seconds. Warm path data lives in a data warehouse or a data lake. It is indexed and searchable. Your analysts can run complex queries across months of data. Performance is still good, but the cost is lower because you are accepting that slight delay. Microsoft Sentinel's basic logs tier costs less than analytics logs for exactly this reason. The data is still there, but it isn't optimized for a sub-second response. The cold path is for long-term retention and archive data. You keep this for regulatory reasons or for forensics if a multi-year investigation is ever needed, but you don't keep it hot. You store it in cheap long-term archive storage. Retrieval takes time, but the cost is minimal. But here's the problem. Ingesting everything into the hot path is expensive. Microsoft Sentinel charges $2.46 per gigabyte for analytics logs. A large organization generating millions of events per day will hit hundreds of thousands of dollars per month very quickly. You cannot ingest everything hot. You have to be selective. The filtering strategy is simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Do not ingest everything. Filter at the source. Pull only high-severity alerts into your hot path. Pull only admin actions and risky sign-ins from your audit logs. Filter your activity logs for unusual patterns before you ever pay to ingest them. This filtering happens in Graph before the data even enters your paid platforms. It is free, and it reduces your data volume dramatically. The practical approach is to use Graph's OData filtering to pre-process data before ingestion. You create automated pipelines that pull data from Graph, apply your rules, and then decide which path each event takes. High severity alert, hot path. Low severity, warm path. Routine user login from a normal location, warm path. Impossible travel detection, hot path. Your data architecture shapes your entire security operation. A well-designed architecture means you detect threats fast and respond fast while keeping costs under control. A poorly designed architecture means you are paying for massive volumes of data that you never actually use. Speed is slow because you are drowning in noise. The discipline is filtering. The outcome is control. The critical Graph endpoints. You don't need to memorize every single endpoint Graph exposes. There are hundreds. But there is a tight set of endpoints that form the backbone of security automation. Understanding them matters, because this is where theory meets practice. Start with the alert endpoints. The legacy interface is @/security/alerts, but it is being deprecated by April of 2026. Do not build new automation against it. Use /security/alerts_v2 instead. This is the unified alert schema that Microsoft is standardizing on. It pulls alerts from all your Defender products into one place with one schema. It is much cleaner than the old model. Incidents are different from alerts. An incident is an aggregated event that groups related alerts together. The system recognizes that 5 separate alerts are actually just one coordinated attack. It groups them into an incident and surfaces them through /security/incidents. This endpoint is valuable because the correlation is already done for you. You aren't looking at 5 separate alerts. You're looking at one incident that tells a story. For identity signals, you need /identity protection/risky users and /identity protection/risk detections. These endpoints expose the probabilistic risk that identity protection is calculating. A user object tells you their basic attributes. A risky user object tells you they are flagged as potentially compromised. A risk detection object tells you the specific reason why, like impossible travel or leaked credentials. These 3 endpoints form your identity risk layer. Audit logs split into 2 streams. /audit logs/sign-ins captures every successful authentication and every failed attempt. This is the log of who accessed your tenant and when. /audit logs/directory audits captures administrative actions like role assignments and policy changes. Any modification to your directory structure flows through here. Together, they form your forensic record. Conditional access policies live at /identity/conditional access/policies. This is where policy as code begins. You can query the complete list of policies your tenant has or retrieve individual ones to see their exact configuration. You can create, update, or delete policies programmatically. This endpoint is your interface to your enforcement layer. Applications show up in two places. /applications lists the apps you have explicitly registered in Entra. /service principals lists the objects that represent those apps and managed identities operating in your tenant. The distinction matters. An app registration is the definition, but a service principal is the actual instance. You register an app once, but it might create multiple service principals across different tenants. Query service principals to see what is actually running in your environment. Permission grants live at /OAuth2 permission grants. This is where the rubber meets the road. It is one thing to register an app, but it is another thing to actually grant it permissions. This endpoint shows you every delegated permission grant in your tenant. Query it to see what permissions are granted and cross-reference that with your application inventory. This is how you spot overprivileged applications or orphaned grants from deleted apps. Finally, /Microsoft Graph /activity logs is your window into the API layer itself. Every HTTP request to Graph in your tenant gets logged here. You can see which app made the call, what endpoint they hit, and what time they did it. Most organizations don't even know this endpoint exists, but it is the most powerful visibility tool you have to see what applications are actually doing. The practical approach isn't to master all of these at once. Pick two, start with /security/alerts _v2 and /audit logs /sign-ins. Learn to query them and process the responses. Understand what data they give you and what they don't. Then add another endpoint. Build your knowledge incrementally. The real insight is straightforward. These endpoints are the interface to your tenant's security model. They aren't just data sources, they are the structural layer that defines what is possible. Learning them well is an investment that compounds. Every endpoint you master makes you more dangerous as a security practitioner. Querying at scale without hitting limits. Graph has rate limits. They exist to protect the infrastructure from being overwhelmed. Roughly 10,000 requests per 10 minutes per application. That number sounds high until you actually start building continuous security pipelines. Then you realize you can burn through that quota in minutes if you're not careful. The practical challenge emerges once you start thinking like an operator, not a developer. You're not making one query to understand how something works. You're making queries continuously. Every 5 minutes, you're pulling new alerts. Every minute, you're checking for risky users. Every 10 seconds, you're monitoring app activity patterns. The requests add up, your quota disappears, and you're stuck waiting for the reset. But here's the problem. Most organizations hitting rate limits are doing it wrong. They aren't hitting limits because they're pulling massive amounts of data. They're hitting limits because they're pulling the same data over and over in inefficient ways, retrieving all alerts and then filtering client-side instead of filtering server-side, making separate requests for each user instead of batching requests together, running the same query multiple times when they could cache results. The solution is efficiency, and efficiency means understanding the tools Graph gives you. Filtering is your first lever. Don't retrieve all alerts and then filter client-side. Use OData filters to tell the API what you actually want. Send a filter like severity EQ high as part of your request. The API filters on the server. You get back only high severity alerts, fewer results, faster query, less data transfer. One well-written filter cuts your request volume by half. Pagination is the second lever. Graph returns results in pages. By default, it returns 20 items per page. If you want the next 20, you paginate. Using top to specify a larger page size means fewer pagination calls. Asking for 50 items per page instead of 20 cuts your pagination overhead by 60%. But don't just pick a large number blindly. There are limits. The system has maximum page sizes for different endpoints. Respect those. Find the balance between fetching enough data to be efficient and not hitting the maximum. Batching is more powerful, but requires different thinking. Instead of making 10 separate requests to get data about 10 different users, you can batch them into one request that returns all 10 users. Graph's batch endpoint lets you pack multiple operations into a single HTTP call. One network round trip, one rate limit consumption, 10 operations. This is powerful when you're dealing with hundreds of items. Time windowing changes the model entirely. Instead of querying all alerts in my tenant, query alerts created in the last 5 minutes. Instead of all audit events, query audit events from the last hour. This dramatically reduces the data volume. Your query is cheaper, it's faster. You're only getting new data, not reprocessing old data you already have. The practical pattern for continuous ingestion works like this. Create a scheduled job that runs every 5 minutes. The job remembers when it last ran. It queries for alerts created since that time. It queries for audit events since that time. It queries for risk detection since that time. The job processes the data, updates its bookmarks, sleeps. 5 minutes later, it runs again. Now it only processes new data that arrived in those 5 minutes. The system is efficient, the quota lasts. The ingestion is continuous without slamming the API. Efficiency is what lets you actually run graph-driven security at scale. You're not trying to retrieve everything. You're trying to retrieve what matters in the most efficient way possible. That discipline keeps you within limits and keeps your system responsive. Handling failures and latency. Graph is a distributed system. Sometimes requests fail. Sometimes the response takes longer than expected. You're building continuous automation on top of an infrastructure that doesn't guarantee instantaneous success. That's just reality. The question isn't whether failures will happen. The question is whether your pipeline survives them. 4 types of failures matter in practice. Rate limiting returns HTTP 429. You've exceeded your quota. Temporary service issues return HTTP 503. The backend is overloaded or temporarily down. Authentication failures return HTTP 401. Your token expired or your credentials are invalid. Permission issues return HTTP 403. Your app doesn't have permission to access what you're asking for. Each one requires a different response strategy. When you hit rate limiting, you wait and retry. The response header tells you how long to wait. Respect that. Don't be aggressive. Don't hammer the API hoping it recovers faster. The system is telling you to back off. Back off. Once you wait the requested duration, retry the request. It'll usually succeed. Temporary service issues are similar. The backend is having trouble. Wait and retry. But don't use the same wait duration as rate limiting. Service issues might need longer. Use exponential backoff. Start with 1 second. If the retry fails, wait 2 seconds before the next attempt. Then 4, then 8. Keep doubling until you hit a maximum, maybe 5 minutes. Add randomness to the wait duration so you don't have 1,000 applications all retrying at exactly the same time. That randomness is called jitter. It prevents thundering herd problems where synchronized retry attempts hammer the service and keep it down longer. Authentication failures need a different approach. Your token expired. Don't retry the same request with the same token. You'll just get 401 again. Instead, refresh your token, get a new one, then retry the original request. If refreshing the token fails, something's wrong with your credentials. Log the error. Alert on it. Don't keep retrying. You won't fix it by trying harder. You need human intervention. Permission issues mean your application doesn't have permission to access what you're asking for. Retrying won't fix that. The problem isn't transient, it's structural. You need higher permissions. Log the error. Skip this request. Move on. Don't consume retries on something that'll never succeed. Idempotency is where most automation fails. Let's say your pipeline pulls an alert, processes it, and stores it in your CM, but the network timeouts before you get a success confirmation. Did the store succeed? You don't know. So you retry. The alert gets stored again. Now you have 2 copies of the same alert in your system. This creates noise. It triggers duplicate notifications. It messes up your metrics. The solution is idempotency. Design your system so that processing the same alert twice produces the same result as processing it once. Use deduplication. Check if an alert with this ID already exists before storing it. If it does, skip it. If it doesn't, store it. Now duplicates don't create problems. Latency handling is about accepting reality. Alerts might take 5 minutes to appear in Graph. Your automation should tolerate that. Don't build systems that expect real time. Don't design responses that assume instant feedback. Design for eventual consistency. Your job isn't to know everything immediately. Your job is to know everything correctly within an acceptable time frame. Your pipeline should handle failures gracefully. Log them, alert on repeated failures. If the same query fails 3 times in a row, escalate to a human. Maybe there's a real problem. Maybe permissions changed. Maybe the graph service is having broader issues when something breaks repeatedly. You need to know. The real model is simple. Reliability beats speed. A slow system that always works beats a fast system that occasionally fails. Design for that. Build, retry logic. Design for idempotency. Accept latency. Monitor failures. These aren't nice to haves. They're the foundation of a system that actually works at scale. Governing graph access. Graph is powerful. An application with the wrong permissions can do damage that takes months to fully understand. You need governance, but not the kind of governance that says no to everything. You need a model that says yes, but with controls. The difference is simple. It determines if your organization innovates safely or if it innovates recklessly. The permission model in Graph uses Microsoft Entra permissions where every application needs explicit permission to call a specific endpoint. When you register an app, you specify exactly what it needs. When you deploy it, an administrator has to consent to those permissions. That consent creates a grant, and that grant is what allows the application to finally call those endpoints. The practical model starts with one principle: least privilege. Request only the permissions your application actually needs right now, not the permissions it might need someday, and definitely not the permissions a vendor threw in just to future-proof their software. This is harder than it sounds. Vendors have a habit of requesting broad permissions because mail, read, write, all is easier for them to implement than specific scenarios, but what is easier for them creates a massive risk for you. Permission categories matter. Read-only permissions are safer than write permissions, and write permissions are safer than administrative ones. You can see this in the naming. Mail.read is safer than mail. Read-write, which is safer than mail. Read-write all. The scope of each permission shapes the risk. A permission that applies only to the signed-in user creates much less exposure than one that covers the entire tenant. Build your strategy around this hierarchy. Admin consent is required for high-risk permissions. When an app wants to access the entire organization or change the directory structure, an administrator has to approve it. This isn't security theater. It is a genuine speed bump. Someone has to look at the request and decide if it makes sense or if it is simply too risky. That moment of deliberation is what catches mistakes and intentional overreach. Conditional access now extends to workload identities. These are your service principals and your automated processes. You can apply conditional access policies to these apps just like you do for your users, restrict them to known locations, require them to authenticate only from specific IP ranges, enforce MFA for sensitive operations. If a service principal suddenly starts making requests from an unexpected location, conditional access can block it. This is how you defend automation against abuse. Audit everything. Use graph activity logs to see what applications are actually doing. If an app requested mail, read write all 6 months ago, but the logs show it has never made a write request, that permission is unnecessary. You can revoke it. The app still functions, but your exposure shrinks. This is governance in motion. It isn't a one-time policy that sits on a shelf. It is a continuous review based on how things are actually used. Approval workflows matter for high-risk decisions. When someone requests a new application or a permission bump, where does that request go? Does it sit in an inbox? Does it get auto-approved? You need to define the workflow and document it. Make it clear that high-risk permissions require a visible and auditable approval process. This creates accountability. Someone's name is on that approval. So if something goes wrong, there is a record of why that decision was made. Regular reviews create discipline. Quarterly is a reasonable minimum for this. Pull the list of all applications and their permissions and then ask the hard questions. Do we still use this app? Do we still need these permissions? Are there new apps we haven't reviewed yet? Remove the ones you don't need. And reduce the permissions on the ones you keep. This isn't punishment, it's housekeeping. It is the difference between a tight security posture and one that is slowly eroded by inertia. The real insight about governance is simple. It's not about saying no. It's about creating a system where yes is informed and intentional, where permissions are justified, use is visible, and removal is easy. That system doesn't stop innovation, it enables it. You aren't blocking applications. You are making sure they are deployed with the minimum power necessary to do the job. That is the model that scales. The title said trick. How to trick Microsoft Graph into securing your entire tenant. But the trick isn't a trick at all. It's understanding something structural that most organizations completely miss. Graph isn't just an API. It is the actual governance engine underneath everything in Microsoft 365. Every security decision in your tenant flows through it. Every sign-in, every policy evaluation, every permission grant, it is all Graph. And when you understand that, everything changes. You stop looking at portals. You stop doing manual quarterly permission audits. You stop waiting for analysts to investigate alerts. Instead, you build a continuous system. Data flows in from Graph. It is enriched automatically, and it is correlated across every source you have. It triggers responses without human delay. Your security starts operating at machine speed, not human speed. Microsoft is retiring legacy APIs. The 2026 shift is real. Everything is consolidating onto the Graph Security API v2. That isn't Microsoft being nice. That is Microsoft forcing the industry to make a structural shift that should have happened years ago. The organizations that understand this now have an advantage. They aren't scrambling to migrate when the deadline hits. They've already built their security engine. Their people understand Graph, and their automations are already working. When the deadline comes, they are ready. That's the model. That's security for 2026. Now build it.